Welcome back. I hope everyone is doing well. Today I'm going to go through the notes for multiplying, dividing, and simplifying rational expressions. We will start with simplifying rational expressions, and then we'll move into the multiplying and dividing. On simplifying expressions, first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make sure that it is in factored form if it is not already in factored form. This first problem we look at is A times C and B over B times C equals A over B. So what ends up happening, there's nothing to factor there, and all you're going to do is simplify common terms, common factors from top to bottom. As you can see, there's a C on top and a C on bottom, so the C on top and the C on bottom cancels, leaving us with A over B. When we look at the second example here, we have x plus 1 times x plus 2 over 2 times x plus 1. Those are already in factored form. So since they're in factored form, all we're going to do is we're going to cancel or simplify common factors from the top and the bottom. So I have an x plus 1 on top and an x plus 1 on bottom, and that simplifies down to leave us with just an x plus 2 on top and a 2 on bottom. Another thing we're going to have to look at on these is any excluded values, just like we did when we were graphing. Okay, and our excluded values are any value that would make the denominator 0. So in this first problem it says x plus 1. So that tells us if we have x equals a negative 1, x equals a negative 1 would make that 0, and you cannot divide by 0 because it leaves us undefined. So x equals negative 1 is an excluded value, so x cannot equal negative 1. And that is our excluded value in this instance. All right, we'll look at a couple more here. So we've got 2x over x plus 7, and then we've got 3 over x plus 7. And I'm going to start with my excluded values. As you can see, the denominator, I have x plus 7, so the only value that would make that denominator 0 is 7. So my excluded value would be x cannot equal negative 7. That is our excluded value. And then from there, all I would do is simplify common factors since it is already in factored form. The x plus 7 and the x plus 7 would cancel, and we would be left with 2x over 3. And that would be your simplified form. All right, now we'll move on to B. As you can see on B, it is not factored. All right, so I'm going to factor first, and this just has a common factor. Both on top have an x, so I'm going to factor out an x. That's going to leave us with x, and then x minus 6. All right, and then on the bottom I've got x squared, so I can factor that down to just be x times x. If you want to leave it as x squared, you can do that as well. Just make sure you cancel the common factors. All right, now when I'm looking at my common factors in this case, the only common factor we have is the x on top and the x on bottom. So those cancel, and that leaves us with a simplified form of x minus 6 over x, and that is your simplified form. And remember, you cannot cancel a binomial with a monomial. The common mistake that students make is try to cancel these x's, but this x is not a standalone x because it is attached to that 6, making it a binomial. And on our excluded values, the only thing that would make our denominator 0 is if that x was 0, because 0 times anything would be 0, so the only excluded value is 0. And that is how we would simplify and get our excluded values on this one. All right, on C. C, we have an x plus 2 over x squared minus 4. So we're going to go ahead. There's nothing to factor on the top, so that's just going to leave us with x plus 2. On the bottom, that is the difference of squares. It's a perfect square minus a perfect square. So we're going to factor that down with our difference of squares to be x plus 2 times x minus 2. Just like this. Now I'm going to go ahead and get my excluded value since we have our denominator in factored form. So our excluded values in this case would be -2 would make the first one 0, so x cannot equal -2. And then on the second one, x minus 2, 2 minus 2 would be 0, so that would be our excluded value there. So x cannot equal 2, because anything that makes our denominator 0 is an excluded value. Now I'll go ahead and I'm going to simplify my common factors. I have an x plus 2 on top and an x plus 2 on bottom. Those are our common factors. Now, when we divide, anything divided by itself is 1. So x plus 2 divided by x plus 2 is 1. So what that leaves us with on top is a 1 on top and then an x minus 2 on bottom. So there is our simplified form and our two excluded values. Now move on to D. Okay, once again, factor both the numerator and the denominator. X squared minus 9, that is a difference of squares again. I've got a perfect square minus a perfect square, so I'm going to factor that down to be x plus 3 and x minus 3. Difference of squares just like we've worked on before. On the bottom, x minus 3, that one will not factor, so that just stays x minus 3. So now that we've got it in factored form, let's go ahead and look at our excluded values. The denominator is x minus 3. So the only value that's going to make that 0 will be a positive 3, because 3 minus 3 is 0. So our excluded values would be positive 3. So x cannot equal a positive 3. Now go ahead and simplify our common factors. I got an x minus 3 on top and an x minus 3 on bottom, so those will cancel. And what that leaves us with is just an x plus 3 on top, and it would be a, once again, x minus 3 divided by x minus 3 would be 1, so that would leave us with a 1 on bottom. Now anything divided by 1 stays the same, so we'll just leave that as x plus 3. So our simplified form on this one would be x plus 3. Our only excluded value would be x cannot equal 3. All right, moving on to E here. Okay, now here we're going to have to factor. There's no leading coefficient. So since there's not a leading coefficient, we know that x squared is going to break down into be x and x. Now, on this, the factor is a 15, so we want to find out what multiplies to give us 15 that's going to subtract to give us a negative 2. So that's going to go 5 and 3, because 5 times 3 is 15, and I need that to subtract to get 2. So that needs to be a negative 5 and a positive 3, because negative 5 plus 3 is negative 2, negative 5 times 3 is negative 15. Same factors that we've done before. Here's another difference of squares on the bottom, so that's going to break down to be x plus 3 and x minus 3. So now that we've got a factor, we'll go ahead and account for our excluded values. X plus 3, so that would be a negative 3. And remember, your excluded values are only the denominator. So x cannot equal negative 3. That's one excluded value. X minus 3, that's going to give us x cannot equal positive 3. So there's your excluded values. Now we'll simplify our common factors. I got an x plus 3 and an x plus 3. Those will cancel. That's going to leave us with x minus 5 on top over x minus 3 on bottom. And that is your simplified form. Now, once again, we cannot cancel those x's. I know that's a common mistake people want to make. But the only thing that's going to cancel this x minus 5 is another x minus 5. So be careful not to make those mistakes. All right, and the last one here. We're going to factor again. So we've got this, once again, there's no leading coefficient. So I'll factor the top. That's going to go x and x. The factors, now we're looking for the factors of 6, and that's a plus 6. So we're looking at what multiplies to give us 6 that will add to give us 5. So that's going to be 3 and 2. And since it's a positive 5, they will both be plus. Because 3 times 2 gives us 6, and 3x plus 2x would end up giving us 5x. So that's x plus 3 over x plus 2. Now I need to factor this first one, that x squared, no leading coefficient, so that's going to factor down to be x and x. And then what multiplies to give me 2 that adds to give me 3 is going to give me 2 and 1. Because 2 times 1 is 2. It's a positive, so I need to add to get 3, and 2 plus 1 is 3. And don't forget about that other binomial we had there, that x plus 3. All right, so now we've got that. So now we're going to have 3 excluded values because I got the x plus 2, so the excluded value there, and I'm going to write those over here on the left side. So the excluded value would be x cannot equal a negative 2. And then the next one for that x plus 1, the excluded value would be a negative 1. And then for the x plus 3, that would be a negative 3. So there's our excluded values. Now I'm going to go ahead and cancel my common factors. I've got an x plus 2 on bottom and an x plus 2 on top. I got an x plus 3 on bottom and an x plus 3 on top. So everything on top cancels, so that leaves us with 1 because anything divided by itself is 1. And then all I'm left with on the bottom is the x plus 1. Now here's another one of those chances you cannot cancel this 1 with the 1 on the bottom because the 1 on the bottom is part of that binomial of 1 over x plus 1. And that is your simplified form and your excluded values. We will now move on to actual multiplication of rational expressions. This is going to be very similar to the simplifying that we just did. There's just going to be a few more that we have to account for. When we're multiplying, our first step is going to be to factor each numerator and each denominator, if possible. Sometimes they won't factor, but we're going to factor them if possible. All right, so this first numerator is 3x squared, so I'm just going to make that 3 times x, because x times x is x squared, and x squared times 3 is 3x squared. The denominator there, that's x squared, so there's no leading coefficient, so I'm going to factor that. That's just going to become x and x. And then the factors of 8, since it's a negative 8, the factors of negative 8 that subtract to give me 2. So that would be a negative 4 and a positive 2, because negative 4 times 2 is negative 8, and then the negative 4 plus 2 would combine to give you the negative 2x. All right, so we factored the first one. Now we'll factor the second one. Those all have a 2 in common, so I'll factor out that common factor. So divide by 2 gives me x squared, divide by 2 gives me a minus 3x, divide by 2 gives me a minus 10. Make sure you always factor out the common factor. On the bottom here, there's no common factor, that's just an x squared, so that factors down to be x and x. And then the factors, what multiplies to give me 10, that subtracts to give me 3 is going to be a minus 5 and a positive 2. Because negative 5 times 2 is negative 10, negative 5 plus 2 is negative 3. All right, still have one more factor. I'm going to rewrite these. Those are already done. I want to get this all factored down. So that's going to leave us with x minus 4 and x plus 2. And then on the top, this is the one I need to factor. That's an x squared. So I'm going to factor that x squared down to be x and x. And now I need the factors of 10 that subtract to give me 3, which will be 5 and 2. And that's a negative 3, so that needs to be a minus 5 and a positive 2, because negative 5 times 2 is negative 10, negative 5 plus 2 is negative 3. All that, and then that's going to leave me on bottom an x minus 5 and an x plus 2. All right, so now we've got everything factored, so now we can account for our excluded values. Remember, anything that makes our denominator 0. So each one of these factors will have a excluded value. So x minus 4, the excluded value will be a positive 4. X plus 2, the excluded value will be a negative 2. X minus 5, the excluded value will be a positive 5. And then the x plus 2 is excluded value will be a negative 2 again, which I'm not going to rewrite it because we've already got that accounted for on that one right there. All right, so now we've got our excluded values. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at this as it's one large fraction, because we can reduce anything from numerator to denominator. So I'm going to make this, I'm going to draw this line and extend this out to one large fraction. And I'm going to simplify any common factors. Like I have an x minus 5 here and an x minus 5 here. Those cancel. I've got an x plus 2 here and an x plus 2 here. Those cancel. Now I've got an x minus 4. There's no x minus 4s on top. I got an x plus 2. There's no additional x plus 2s on top, so I can't cancel that. I got a 2 on top and a 3 on top. Nothing there. X and an x, nothing there. So now that we've simplified all of our common factors, all we're going to do is multiply what is left back together. So I'm going to go 2 times 3, that gives us 6, and then x times x, and that leaves us with x squared. On the bottom, we could multiply that back together, or you can leave it in factored form. X minus 4, x plus 2. And there are benefits to leaving it in factored form as we move forward when we're solving in different things. So that is a correct answer, but you could also see this where they actually multiply it out, where you would see it in this form here, where I go x times x gives us the x squared, 2x and negative 4x gives us negative 2x, and then negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. And those are our answers. And both are the same. You can leave your answer as a factored form, or if you can also multiply it back out. And that is how you multiply rational expressions. All right, let's look at one more of these rational expressions here. Make sure everybody knows what we're doing. All right, so on this next one, we're going to factor out our common factor on the top. So that's x squared minus 8x. So the common factor is x. So I'll factor that out. That leaves me at x minus 8. On the bottom, I've got a 14 out here. And then I factor my x squared plus 8x plus 15. There's no leading coefficient on that, so that's going to factor down just to be x and x. And then I need to factor what multiplies give me 15, that adds to give me 8. So that'd be plus 5 and plus 3. Because 5 times 3 is 15, 5 plus 3 is 8. All right, so we've got the first fraction factored, so now we're going to do the same thing with the second. 7x plus 35, all they have in common is 7. So I'll factor out that common factor. So divide by 7 leaves us with x, divide by 7 leaves us with 5. Make sure that that works. 7 times x is 7x, 7 times 5 is 35. So we factored out the common factor correctly. Now on this next one, we've got an x plus 8. That x plus 8, nothing to factor there, so that just stays x plus 8. All right, go ahead and account for our excluded values. The 14 does not have a x on it, so nothing to worry about there. The x plus 5, the excluded value for x plus 5 would be a negative 5. The x plus 3, the excluded value would be a negative 3. And then the x plus 8, the excluded value would be a negative 8. So make sure you count for all of those excluded values. Anything that makes the denominator 0 will be undefined. So account for those, because when we start solving, you have to account for those as well. So now that we've done that, now we're going to look at it as one large fraction. And then we're just going to start simplifying our common factors. All right, so on top, I have a x plus 5 and an x minus x plus 5 on top and on bottom, so I'll cancel those. I got an x minus 8 and an x plus 8. Those are not common factors because they have one's at minus and one's positive, so you cannot simplify those. X on top, there's no x's on bottom to simplify. X plus 3, there's no x plus 3's on top. The only other thing we can do is we can reduce our numbers, because 7 and 14 are both divisible by 7, so I'm going to factor, so I'm going to divide by 7, that's going to leave us with 1. I'm going to divide by 7, that's going to leave us with 2. We divided, we just reduced the 7 and the 14. So now what we're left with is we got 1 times x, and that's just going to leave us with x, and then x minus 8. All of that over 2, and then we have an x plus 3 and an x plus 8. And that is our simplified form. And I'm just going to leave it in factored form because normally that's the way you're going to see those. Normally when we see them, they're going to be left in factored form because when we start solving, that's going to be one of the things we're going to look at. So that is multiplying of rational expressions. I'll give you let you look at these two here. These are two problems that I want you to kind of work on, because I'm not actually going to give any homework, any actual practice problems on this other than these two. Then I'll give you two division ones when we get there as well. So I'll give you a minute or two to get those copied down, and then we will go on to division. All right, if you need to pause the video to get those, go ahead and pause it so you can get those and practice those two problems. And we're going to go ahead and move on to division. Once again, very similar to the work we've already done. Now, when we're dividing fractions, this goes back to your dividing of fractions when you're in elementary school. Whenever we divide fractions, we end up multiplying by the denominator. I'm sorry, multiplying by the reciprocal. So what we're going to do on these is we're going to go ahead and we're going to take this x plus 2 and x minus 4. And instead of dividing, we're going to multiply by the reciprocal. So I'm going to flip the fraction. So you're going to change that division to multiply, and then you're going to take the fraction, the right side, and just flip it. So instead of being x over 3x minus 12, it'll be 3x minus 12 over x, just like that. So we just change this, and then you just flip the right side. Okay, just take the reciprocal. Now that I've done that, now we're into the exact same process as we were before. We're going to factor each one. So x plus 2 is already factored, so I'll leave that as x plus 2. X minus 4 is already factored, so I'll leave that as x minus 4. On the top here, 3x minus 12, they have a 3 in common. They're both divisible by 3, so I factor out that common factor. Divide by 3 leaves me with x. Divide by 3 leaves me with 4. Make sure you check it so that you got that factored out correctly, because 3 times x is 3x, 3 times negative 4 is negative 12. All of that over x. Now that I've got this, I'm going to go ahead and account for my excluded values. Now there is this is the one difference on division other than having to flip the fraction. So I got my x minus 4, so that would be 4, so that's one excluded value. X, the only thing to make that 0 would be if x itself was 0, so that's going to be x cannot equal 0. That's your second excluded value. And then you have the only other one you would have is you also have to account for this original denominator, the 3x minus 12, which ends up being this one. So you have to end up on that numerator, that x minus 4, you have to account for that as well. The 0 of that x minus 4 would be 4, because 4 minus 4 gives you 0. So that would also be 4, so I'm not going to rewrite it. But make sure when you're doing your excluded values, after you take the reciprocal, you have to take the denominator and the numerator of that right fraction. All right, so make sure you get that accounted for. Now that we've done the excluded values, now I'm going to look at this as one large fraction, and I'm going to cancel my common factors. Got an x minus 4 on bottom and an x minus 4 on top. Those cancel. That looks like the only common factor we have. So what we're left with is we're left with a 3 and an x plus 2 on top. So just write it 3 times x plus 2 right there like that. And on bottom, all we're left with is an x. And once again, you could multiply that out, but for this case, we'll just leave it that way. And that is how you simplify division. All right, let's look at one more. All right, so now on this x plus 7 squared. All right, so let's go ahead and let's flip our fraction first. So we're going to say that just going to stay x plus 7 squared over x squared. We'll do our factoring in just a minute. Now, once again, change my division to be multiplication, and then just flip the fraction. So that x squared plus x minus 2 over x squared plus 9x and then plus 14. All right, so there's our multiplying by the reciprocal. We just flipped the fraction. Now we're back to multiplication, so we'll factor it. The x plus 7 squared, all I'm going to do on the x plus 7 squared is I'm going to rewrite that as x plus 7 times x plus 7. That'll account for both of them because of the square. Same thing on the bottom, x squared, I'm just going to account for that. I'm going to make that x times x. Here, once again, no leading coefficient, so that's going to factor down to be x and x. And we need the factors of 2 that subtracts to give us 1. So when multiplies give us 2, the subtracts to give us 1, which will be 2 and 1. Now I need it to be a positive 1, so that's going to be plus 2 minus 1, because 2 times negative 1 gives us negative 2, and 2 minus 1 is 1. Factor the bottom the same way, so that's going to go x and x. No leading coefficient. Now I need the factors of 14 that add to give us 9. Since it's a positive 14, what multiplies to give us positive 14 adds to give us 9, which would be 7 and 2. And it's a positive, so it's plus 7 and plus 2. Go ahead and get my excluded values here. So x, the only thing to make that 0 will be zeros for each of those, so that'd be x cannot equal 0. That's your first excluded value. On the other side, we got x plus 7, so that would be x cannot equal negative 7. And then we got x plus 2, so that would be x cannot equal negative 2. Now, and don't forget on this right side, you also have to account for the numerator. So x plus 2, that would be negative 2, which we already have. But then we have this x minus 1. So to account for that one, that would be x cannot equal positive 1. So it's only the right side you have to do the numerator, but make sure you account for both the numerator and the denominator on that right fraction. So now that we've done that, all we're going to do is we'll look at it as one large fraction and simplify our common factors. I got an x plus 2 on top and an x plus 2 on bottom. I got an x plus 7 on top and an x plus 7 on bottom. All right. There are no other x plus 7s or x's. Nothing else will cancel. So what we're left with on top is the x plus 7 and the x minus 1. And on bottom, all we're left with is the x times the x, which I am going to go ahead and rewrite that as x squared, because that's normally the way you'll see that. And that is your simplified form with your excluded values. And that is multiplying and dividing and simplifying rational expressions. I'll give you 2 problems here. So there's 4 problems I want you to complete. All right, so there's 2 multiplication on the earlier page, and then these 2 C and D for division. So work through those 4 problems, and I will send some further problems to you through our Google Classroom or my email on my website. You can also check your problems to make sure you got those right if you go to the notes on my website. So on the notes on my website, the answers, both of these are already worked out, so you can check your work to make sure you have an understanding of what you're doing on multiplying and dividing of the rational expressions. If you have any questions or need any help or want me to look through anything that you have, send me an email and I'll be glad to help you out there. I hope everybody is well, stay healthy, and look forward to getting back in touch with you soon. Thank you very much. Everybody have a great day.